Thank you very much for the organizers to allow me to come to this great country. I don't know if people from Switzerland know this, but we people from Costa Rica are known as the Switzerland of Central America. That's supposed to be a nice thing for us. I don't know what you think about that, but I do promise Costa Rica is also a pretty country. We also have mountains and cows. So let me give you a little bit of background and perhaps emphasize some of the themes my colleagues in the morning and the afternoon have touched upon. So we're in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, this crisis driven by the excesses, as was mentioned, in the financial sector. And I do want to show that we have been growing, but also notice that throughout this period, developing countries have been growing more than rich countries. That, of course, relates to the fact that they're growing from a lower base. But I do want to emphasize that behind some of these trends, there has been development. The pie has increased. And in many of the discussion, and I think it was mentioned also in the morning, do forget that many people have been driven out of poverty in the last decades. So as a background, and I do want to mention that I consider myself a child of globalization. My father had the good fortune to work in a multinational, Bayer, which you probably pronounce differently in German. Because of that, we were a middle income family in Costa Rica. My mom studied math. She was the director of a public school. I always knew that if I wanted to study abroad, I needed a scholarship, but I wanted to study abroad. So I went and studied in Chile, in the US. I met my husband, who's Brazilian, and my daughter was born in the US. So in many ways, and also coming from an emerging market, I think I do have to stand up for globalization because my country and many of the people I know have benefited from it. And so we have seen these cross-border flows in goods, service, investment, and also ideas. And we have emphasized the role of trade, but there has been an important technological change behind these trends. The way production is organized has changed, the way we sell, the way we organize. And the classic example is the electronics that chips, where we initially were allowed to differentiate production from R&D, from design. Companies in the US started to go in abroad, but the same trend we see in many products. This is the global value chain. So I would add Intel chips and chips to your list, and computers to that list. And again, a big part of this change has been driven by technology, to the point that the factory that is now in Mexico producing auto parts, if it comes back to the US, it's not going to hire the same number of workers because it uses a lot of technology, but it's also in Mexico hiring higher skilled workers. It's hiring technicians, it's hiring engineers. So this idea of the unskilled worker, that also perhaps has changed because of technology. There was also important political changes behind these trends. So not only the fall of the Soviet Union, the emergence of the Eastern Bloc in Europe, the emergence of the European project, but as has mentioned, changes in China, but also changes in Latin America. Again, I'm the child of the debt crisis. I'm the child of import substitution, a project that for a small open economy like Costa Rica was not delivering, or had, if you want, reached an end in the 80s. Some of these changes is hard to see going back, and they allow for a lot of the dismantling of trade policy and trade barriers that we have seen. Then came the global financial crisis. Again, perhaps that because of the circumstances of how severe it was, we all rethought some of the changes. And at that time, people were worried about a potential backlash to globalization. Looking back in history, that's what happened, the interwar period. And for a while, it seemed okay. And then we got Brexit. And then we got this guy. I had a different picture. Have you seen one where he's like Voldemort? Because I like that thing of thou who shall not be named, but fine. I do have to say, and again, many of my colleagues have emphasized this, I actually don't think there is this huge backlash. And I think we have always known that there are losers to trade. That is in that textbook that everyone goes if they use that economics. It has been known there are losers to trade. But I think perhaps right now some of them seem a little bit more vocal than in the past. One is Brexit, although I do have to say that Brexit was a vote for the unknown. If you try to get 3 people who voted for Brexit to tell you explicitly what is it that they voted for, they cannot tell you. I think they all had their idea what Brexit was, and thus we see these negotiations where it has not been made clear. It was also a political move by the Tory party to remain a party. It's unclear to me that will work at the end, but it was a political calculation. And also, I actually do think there has been a lot of anti-migration. And it was mentioned that it's hard to disentangle what is anti-migration when you're voting for your pocket, but I do think there was a lot anti-migration there. In the US, I also want to remind that he didn't get the majority vote out of the fact that he just gets upset with that. But also, I do think that behind this vote, there was a lot of what the US calls the cultural wars, and you see this conservative movement back in the US, some underground more than explicit. But again, I also think there was a lot anti-migration. Some of that discourse is clearly against certain type of migrants, not all migrants. And behind this, and we were discussing it at night, there was this group for taxes, the tax coalition. So it will be interesting to see what happens if they get this tax vote. David showed some of these polls. Actually see these polls in a very interesting way. In the middle of the global financial crisis, the views against trade being good actually increased, but they have been increasing. And they're actually close to 70%, and it's across the board, like it's all political parties. In fact, I call Gallup, because this goes against a lot of the views we're hearing. I call Gallup to ask how you're doing your sample. Because everyone is saying, everyone in the US hates globalization. And you see, again, it's close to 70% that still thinks this it brings prosperity. Also, again, fueling my view that this is more about something else than trade, this is the trade data from the US. If you look at what the US exports, one of the main partners are, of course, Canada, but also Mexico and Latin America. In fact, the US exports more goods to Latin America than it imports. If you add services, also, it's even more favorable to the US. The clear trade imbalance in the US is against China, and you have seen how the president was in China last week. I have been talking to friends that are negotiating NAFTA, and they do feel this anti-Mexico bias. Actually, it's a little bit more worrisome than I thought. Apparently, they want to score a win here, and again, as I said, it feels this anti-migration, anti-Mexican, more than really this is what is unbalanced in the US. And what is interesting is that destroying NAFTA probably won't help some of the regions and folks that voted for him. A lot are agricultural goods, that is the Midwest, and it's unclear that's going to bring back the auto industry in the US. So trade does enable countries to use resources more efficiently and increase productivity. There are distribution effects. They are not distributed evenly. Some win, some lose. In particular, it has been in the north, the uneducated, the rural, and the unwilling to change. Technology also is the same. They have allowed for efficiency, but it seems also to have an unskilled bias, negative effects, bias towards the skill. And I mention this because in Latin America, we have also seen a skill premium. So if we were supposed to have a comparative advantage in the things that the US didn't, they would have seen a worse income distribution, but we would have seen the lower skill increase. And we also see the skill bias premium in Latin America. And again, this has led to the replacement of some of the unskilled jobs, and it's also unevenly distributed, mostly to the uneducated, rural, and the unwilling to change. There does seem to be this city advantage, part because of agglomeration economies, part because of these new emerging clusters, but some of the recent trends do seem to be against the rural. And this leads me back to this beautiful movie of the 90s. I don't know if you remember, Full Monty. And this, what I like about this is that this is not new. This was there in the 90s. And what is nice about the movie, and I do recommend you go back and see it, the problem they also faced is that they didn't want to change. They felt that going into the service sector was demeaning. And there is this example of the one that was a police, and the friend comes and gets him, why are you being a police? This is not what we were manufacturing people. So again, there is something about these changes, and certain type of people, we usually tend to be male and older, that sort of don't like some of these changes. So again, there are effects. There are also adjustment costs on top of the fact that some sectors would lose. And I think the State Secretary went over all the things we can do to solve some of these problems: safety nets, education, and retraining, infrastructure. And in the US is particularly one country that could improve some of its logistics, as you know. Regulation, lowering barriers to businesses, well-functioning financial markets, but also there are more idiosyncratic policies like tax, executive pay, and so on. The irony in both Brexit and the US is that the political parties that are against these programs are the ones that are benefiting from this, if you want, unhappiness. Remember that the US, a lot of these programs are at the state and local level and not at the federal level. And the Republican Party very vocal against, for example, health policy and others, but also trying to push for very low taxes. Kansas is an example where they lower taxes to such a level that they cannot even fund education. Business, trade, and politics. I would argue that even with these broad changes for liberalization, countries have always used protectionism, of course, not at a broader level than we have seen, but there have always been examples of tariffs here, anti-dumping here, subsidies there. And we used to teach cases like, for example, Chiquita bananas, where Europe decided to block US bananas out of particular no reason other than, oh yes, they were protecting some of the bananas produced in Europe. Probably the bananas in Costa Rica were not good enough, but they're better. Boeing, Airbus, Embraer, again, there are many examples of some of these, again, smaller level, but they have always been there. And so companies that operate in the global trading system should have strategies that contemplate this political risk. They should understand the forces behind this political risk and have scenarios. And again, when there are risks, diversification is one solution. It's an expensive solution, but that is one way one can think of how to tackle some of these risks. But also, think about the role of the private sector. And the private sector is very good at lobbying. You guys know that. I don't need to explain it in many ways and forms. Also, you tend to many times use the comfortable and convenient silences. And I think this is Brexit, and this is what's going on in the US as well. Businesses, in the case of the UK, they favored the Tory party, and so they were silent. In the US, they all perhaps wanted a tax cut, and also they were silent. But building a competitive environment does require decades. The attitudes that are created do have long-lasting effects. If someone believes, and I'm hoping this only will last for years, that the effects of Trump will live with him, sadly, I don't think that will be the case. Some of these anti-migration, anti-everyone else sentiment would sadly linger. Business leaders and firms have a strong influence on the business environment. They shape it directly, they shape it indirectly. And so I think they should collaborate with economic development. They should engage in policy dialogues like this one and try to think more in the system and not perhaps just in the narrow short-term gain. Development, we all gain when there is a relation between GDP growth and the proper distribution. That doesn't mean that they're not going to be losers. It just means that we need to think how we're going to incorporate everyone into the economic opportunities. And if not, I do think Latin America has examples of what can go wrong. We are the region that invented the populists. This is a picture of Peron and then some of my friends from Central America and Venezuela. And the sad thing of this story is that they do feed in the uneducated, they do feed on the poor, and it just turns out that when they come to power and they stay, because for some reason they never leave, it is the poor and uneducated that suffer the most. This has rarely been a recipe for development. It has always been a recipe to create more poverty. Venezuela is one example. Thank you very much.